Roanne, I'm so excited to talk to you. Thank you for logging on in the evening in the Netherlands. I want to talk to you all about your new book, Once Upon a Time We Ate Animals. And it was a refreshing and futuristic look at a what the future could look like if the majority of us got on board with not eating animals anymore. And so I want to ask you right off the bat, walk us through your decision to become a vegan. When did it happen? What tipped the scales in the plant-based favors? Give us all that information.
I did not want to become a vegan. I was completely against vegans, actually. I had been a vegetarian since I was 16. I'm 38 now. And about 5 years ago, I started to do research on the future of food. So I have a double background. I'm an anthropologist and I'm a futurist. So I've always been interested in sketching future scenarios and then thinking through what might this mean for society and for individuals. And back then, I remember myself sitting in a cafe in Philadelphia. I was actually living in the US back then. And I was reading in the newspaper something about cow's milk and how cows were slaughtered if they were males because we don't really need them for the milk industry. And I looked at my cappuccino. I was still drinking cow's milk back then. I'm like, why am I a vegetarian? Well, because I didn't want animals to be killed for my taste. Um, but then, am I now indirectly paying for these animals to be slaughtered while they're still young? And I simply didn't understand. And so, first, my personal research started, and then my more professional research started because became fascinated. But before that, I had always kind of looked down on vegans. That's really harsh to say, but it was like I was associating them with the pale, kind of slow people in the bio shops in the Netherlands, the non very fashionable ones, the ones that had beards right before they became trendy, right? And so I thought they are over the top. I could go with I don't want animals to be killed. I was never a big meat eater anyhow, and so that was easy for me when I was a teenager. Also, I just wanted to be really unique and cool, I think. So for me, becoming vegetarian was kind of attractive, but becoming vegan, that sounded just a bit radical. And then I started reading, and I started to visit farmers and livestock um, holders, and I heard their stories. And after 5 years or so, I knew so much that I really couldn't go back.
Hmm. Knowledge is power, or so they say, right?
Yeah, and it's really annoying because then you don't eat with the same joy you did before. I just kept looking at my plate and be like, I'm now, contributing to a system that I don't like. And so I have a role to play here. And that made me at some point turn vegan.
Well, in your book, right in the introduction, you argue that we are amidst a radical change in the way humans on this planet eat. You argue that the next generation will see unnecessary animal suffering as a thing of the past, and that exploiting animals will be looked down upon, kind of like smoking, right? Like smoking was very cool in decades past. And now, at least in America, I know it's different in perhaps your corner of the world, but smoking is pretty much looked down upon. But I'm wondering, what evidence are you looking at to make this argument?
Well, it's always hard. And I agree with you. It's the same in Europe, actually. I thought smoking was actually a great parallel because there, too, there has been a knowledge transformation where people understood much more than in the 50s of the last century like, oh, this is not good for my health. This is actually really destructive. But at the same time, there was also a cultural shift where, like you say, there was the cool Marlboro guy, the sexy cowboy man. And then nowadays, you would associate it perhaps more with even lower social economic classes, right? So it's really a different way of looking at the same habit. And with eating meat or eating fish or eating dairy, I think we can yeah, I think I'm always trying to double reflect myself, but I really see that there's a trend going towards more flexitarianism, and that is what the statistics show as well, but also more people who really find it a taboo almost to eat it. Now, I never say and I never claim in my book that this will be the whole world. Because I do think that there are countries where it's really hard to find a vegan burger, right? Or where it's really hard to find alternatives. I mean, I've lived amongst the Inuit in Greenland for a while for my anthropological field work, and there people cannot eat anything else than the animals that they have there. And honestly, I don't see the problem with them either, because they are not the ones um, investing or contributing to big industrial farming. They really just eat the animals that they need. And like I said, they have no other option. So, what I did for the book was I really looked into statistics, and I tried to compare, because it's really hard actually. If you go into this topic, and perhaps that was one of the reasons why I really wanted to write this book, it's so polarized. So you'll have the meat lobby at the one hand, and then you'll have the vegan activist and on the other hand, and both have very different numbers about how we eat, what we eat, why we eat, etc. What I try to do is I try to look at the different numbers, and we all know you can interpret statistics in such ways that they talk for your message, right? But I try to look at what the youngsters are doing, and I'm noticing both in these numbers and in the interviews that I've been doing, um, that many of these youngsters really look differently to eating meat. For them, it's much more normal to eat at least vegetarian a couple of days a week, or they just kind of like the vegan chicken nuggets in the supermarket better because they've been born and raised with them. Or what happens also often is that they are really concerned about the climate. And for them, they all are taught nowadays in schools like there's a direct correlation between the climate changes and the way in which we massively eat and keep animals. And so for them, there have now already been law cases against parents or against grandparents where the children say, and they were represented by groups, but where they say, why, when you knew what was going on and when you knew that it is causing so much less carbon or emissions um, to eat plant based, then why did you keep doing what you used to do? And so when I look at those children, then it makes sense what I'm reading in the literature as well, that the vegan movement is one of the fastest growing social movements in the world. Now, again, I'm always a bit hesitant to kind of echo this because that hasn't really been checked. Um, but it is a fast growing movement. And you can certainly see that, at least in the West, people become much more interested and open for plant based eating.
Hmm. Well, I just want to go back around to your comment there on children who prefer vegan chicken nuggets, not even chicken, vegan nuggets, let's say, as opposed to the chicken ones, because that really made me stop and pause for a minute. I have two young daughters, and, um, you know, making the decisions on what to feed them every night is less about what to put on their plate night by night, but more about creating a culture in our household and creating a foundation in which eating the vegan nuggets are commonplace, standard, and just, what we do in this house. So it's not just about dinner, it's about showing them that they can find enjoyment, they can appreciate the plant-based options on the market. As a parent, I am, by what I put in front of them, I am creating those ideals, fostering those ideals in them, and by consequence in the next generation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think we all grew up with, like, I have favorite dishes which involve animal protein, like the chicken soup of my mom when I was sick, right? And I can still kind of remember that and then become melancholic. And then it's hard to think, like, can I never have that again? But if you were born and raised with a different standard, if the norm was different, if you're only used to having vegan cheese instead of the real cheese, I'm not saying everybody should do this, but just imagine how that would be. Then, of course, you're not going to miss something that you haven't known. So I think, and the second thing that you kind of implicitly say as well, I think, children especially, they love animals. And I have a daughter, she just turned 1, and my house is full of those booklets where we see the cow says boo, the sheep says meh, you know. At the same time, she will have, as a toddler, no idea that what she sees in the supermarket is actually the animals that she finds so cute. So I think, without terrifying them, or without blaming them as a system, or putting guilt on them, it is could yeah, it is a good idea to kind of show that there's a relation, that this is actually an animal. And you see, with a lot of children, they don't want that. It feels very unnatural to them. And so, at least getting them used to other tastes, I think, is a really good step in the right direction. And then when they're older, they can make their own decisions and they will be used to both tastes.
I'm wondering though, what do you say? Like, I see, bacon memes all the time. I don't know if you know what a bacon meme is, but bacon, right? Like, I see bacon memes, meat memes. I hear people in my life say, but meat just tastes good, like all the time. What do you say to people who continue to eat meat and dairy because it tastes good?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think they're right that it tastes good. I think often vegans tend to say like, "Oh, it's really easy. You don't have to give up anything." So for me, for example, I was not the biggest fan of meat, so that was an easy step to pull away from. But I have to admit that most of the vegan cheeses, they're just not the same as actual cow's cheese. They're just not. Some of them, the most horrible, taste like plastic. Got to be honest here. And then the best are pretty good. They're still not exactly cheese, but they're really nice to have with a piece of bread. But so I think, first of all, we have to be brave and honest and say, yes, you are giving up things. But it's pretty urgent what is going on. I think, a lot of us are so concerned about the climate. There have been studies from Oxford University that show so clearly that the emissions from the meat industry are ginormous. And every time that you decide to not eat meat, but instead eat plant based, even the things that we consider as the worst plant based things you can eat, like avocado, it still has much less emissions than the best thing you could eat in meat, namely chicken, for example. So I think that sense of guilt, a lot of people have that, or concern, especially if you look at your children or at the nephews of your sister. It really is concerning. What kind of world will they grow up in? And then another thing is that I think when you and I were small, perhaps we still had, I don't know, the farmers who actually had tens of cows, knew them all by name, or the fishermen in our family. It was all pretty romantic still, and this certainly goes for the generation before us. But look at the factories now; it's massive, and all these animals, they're just trapped in a system together with the livestock holders because for them it's unaffordable to go really small scale oftentimes. um, so I think all of us now together, we don't want the animals to be treated in that way. But at the same time, we feel it's inevitable because this is the system, and it's one popular saying. It's also a very dangerous saying, like, oh, it's such a nice idea that we could, transform to a more plant based world. But how could you change a system that is so deeply ingrained into everything, which essentially says we don't have any power, we don't have any decision power, we are controlled over by the corporates, we are controlled over by government regulations. And I think that that is a bit too easy. So for people who say, I just want to keep eating it because I like it so much, first of all, I feel you. I think the taste is legit, it is really good. But is that the most important thing in life? That you have a really nice taste experience? Or could it be a tiny bit less? Because a lot of the plant based food that I've learned to cook and eat is extraordinarily good as well. It's something different, but it's also really good. And you can get used to that. It mostly takes a couple of weeks, just try out new things. And then you find out your new golden spots. So I think that sense of guilt or concern that we now have, getting rid of that, because I took a step in history to really contribute something positive, to really try at least to make a change for the next generation. That itself gives a feeling that I find to be better even than the best steak one could possibly have.
You talk about in Once Upon a Time We Ate Animals how everything essentially would improve if we all adopted, or most of us adopted, a plant based diet, the economy, our individual health, the climate, our culture. And I've talked about the health benefits of plant based on the podcast before. I've talked about the environmental benefits of plant based before. But I'd love to talk to you about how exactly the economy, the worldwide economy, and culture would improve if the majority of humans on this earth adopted a plant-based diet. How?
Yeah, I think for the economy, first of all, it's merely about the people in the economy. So, what I see now, because, if there will be a more plant based agriculture, then that will have its side effects as well, both positive and negative. But if you look at the people in the economy at this moment, if you look at the people working in the slaughterhouses who are extremely underpaid, where the turnover rate is 100% because people get traumatized, they get sick. We've seen it all in the COVID crisis, I think, how unhealthy and harsh that climate really is. Um, I think that is an industry that is so far out of our reach, but it's really problematic and toxic. I also like to look at the economy and see we're going into a next generation, right? The kids that now prefer to go vegetarian because they say, I really love animals or I'm concerned about the climate, those are the kids that have the wallets and the money in 10 years from now. So they're going to be deciding. And then if you look at all the opportunities there are in plant based foods, there's a reason why so many companies now transform um, to plant based milk, for example, or they go and invest. Like some of the biggest meat companies are now investing in plant based alternatives. That's not because they want to support um, uh, their little brothers, right? It's because they see it's lucrative. And the same when I visited livestock and dairy holders. I would go there and ask, why did you stop? Why did you give up your job? And they would be sometimes they said, I really didn't like the way in which my profession had turned. So I grew up, I was the fourth generation. I really love my animals. I felt free. And now I feel just trapped and I have to kill them earlier or have them slaughtered earlier. I have to keep them in ways that I know aren't okay, but I just didn't see a way out until I stopped. But others were very honest also and had a very different reason. And they said it's just very lucrative to go into seaweed or to go into soybeans or to go because that is what the clients want. So I see a lot of opportunities also for lab grown meat. And regarding the culture, there is a beautiful saying by a philosopher, and I've read it, and then I never found back the name of who said it. So if anybody listening knows it, please do email me. You will be my hero for the rest of my life. But he or she said, you cannot have two hearts, one for animals and one for humans. And I kind of think that that is true. I kind of think that you see that in the old Greek philosophers as well, who actually often were vegans. Some of them, like Aristotle, um, uh, or Pythagoras, I believe it was, and he had his own group of people who he, trained to be vegan or asked to be vegan. And his reason was he saw it as a training in being kind. And so he said, if you are so used to killing other creatures, then it kind of hardens your shell. Well, I don't want to really say that. I mean, in my book, I try to really understand myself as well, right? I try to understand why so many good people, because you and I and everybody listening, we're nice people. We're not slaughtering crazy people. But at the same time, if you look at your plate, we're kind of contributing to a system that is really unkind. Um, and so I wanted to understand that what happens in our brains and in our culture that has us do that, sometimes with a feeling of unease when you see on your Facebook feed some kind of slaughterhouse posts and you kind of scroll past it because you don't really want to see that, and then you think, okay, that's an incident. But if you really think about it, you've seen too many incidents, so you kind of know, like, oh, this probably happens more often. But there's something in us that goes away from such uncomfortable feelings and back into, either the belief or the myth, I should say, this is natural for human beings, this is normal, we need it, all of those myths that are now counterposed by scientists, but we still kind of keep them. And then also, I guess, just the fact that everything is so abstract. The thing that you buy in the supermarket doesn't even look like an animal. And I've never seen a slaughterhouse nearby a city, right? They're all in the suburbs, they're all away. So you don't really hear the screaming. So I think in the culture, if you think about it, many of us, if we really allow the numbers and the realistic scenarios to enter our hearts and minds, we don't want to be that person that contributes, but at the same time we don't see a way out, and we're also a bit too lazy, I mean myself included, because it is really comfy to stick to the chicken soup of your mom. And there's the abstractness. But if you think about what if we would be really proud that at least we're trying for the next generation, or we say, I don't want to do this anymore, it just doesn't feel good. You can imagine that that becomes a little bit of a softer culture almost, right?
Yes, your response there really speaks to me. And you mentioned the myths that we hear. You know, eating meat is the natural way of things, eating meat is healthy. I would actually take the word myth and I would change that to, in 2021, almost 2022, I would change the word myth to marketing, right? Like we are marketed to believe that, you know, the meat is the healthy choice, the natural choice. So, Roanne, I want to talk to you about, okay, how does plant based eating look in real life? And I ask this as somebody who's attempted a vegan lifestyle twice and failed twice. Uh, I would say that what works really well for me is when I'm planning out my meals, when I don't allow myself to get hangry. When I get hangry, everything's off the table. But what tripped me up the first time, I went 8 months and I felt really good about my 8 months. But what tripped me up was just a nondescript dinner party. I went to somebody's house. I didn't want to be rude. And in came, I don't even remember what it was, but it wasn't a vegan thing that I ate. So, what challenges did you face in your first weeks and months going vegan? And how would you suggest that listeners who are interested in a vegan lifestyle, how would you suggest they prepare themselves for those challenges?
Yeah, so let's go into the challenges first. So, at first, my first problem was that I never wanted to be a vegan because I thought they were all activists, right? So, there was kind of an identity crisis going on there. And so, I remember myself in the beginning, I never introduced myself as being a vegan. I would say, like, oh, no, or I would use the word plant based because that seemed less activistic. So, I was a bit socially awkward there. And then happened what happened to you as well. I felt such a burden for people who I would visit to have a dinner with. I felt horrible to have to ask them, like, oh, can you cook everything plant based? Because I assumed that would be really hard and unknown for people. So that was my big problem in the beginning, which got myself into troubles because then I would sit there being unhappy, and then either I would eat what they had prepared, or I would kind of, stick around it with my fork, and have a binge on vegan bars or whatever afterwards because I was freaking hungry. Um, what I learned to do, I think a couple of things. First of all, the book really helped me because in the book, I also describe the phenomenon of vegan sexuals, for example, which are often it's about mixed couples where oftentimes for weird reason, it's the woman in the household who says, I want to try and eat more plant based. And then there's the husband who says, well, I don't, for example. Or you have, you know, that can be really hard because then you don't want to whine perhaps all the time. You don't want to be normative, but at the same time, it becomes harder and harder to accept that the other person doesn't want to do that. So I had a lot of interviews with those people, learned a lot with how they deal with communication. I also really discovered in myself a social fear, a fear to take up space, a fear to say, perhaps to be a bit normative, to say, like, I have reasons I don't want to contribute to um, the misabuse of animals, which is my main reason. So that was interesting to see how that was working in my head. And then I just started practicing, and I'm still not the biggest preacher. Like, I will never, I understand why people like meat and dairy so much, but I do now, if I go and have dinner with people, I do announce beforehand. I say, well, I eat plant based, so shall I cook? Shall I bring something? And then sometimes I cook. And what I do, this is my biggest trick for if you have friends over that aren't vegan, do not mention it is vegan. That's what vegans always do. They go like, and this is vegan. Can you believe it? Can you taste the difference? Well, I can guarantee you, if you say that, a lot of the people will be very critical about everything they taste. So instead, I just make a freaking good plant based dinner. I say nothing about it. People have a wonderful meal, and then they'll ask me like, what was this, by the way? And I will say it's seitan, and it tastes like meat, but it's it's different, right? And then sometimes they ask me for the recipe, and that's a little win. I would say the first thing for people who want to try and eat perhaps a little bit more plant-based than meat and fish and dairy than they do now is start small. You know, I have so many still meat eating friends who already transformed completely to oat milk because they just like it better per taste, or because they trained themselves in a week or so to get used to the taste. I think sometimes you have to try a little. I personally do not like soy milk in my coffee, for example, but I do like oat milk. When I discovered that, it became a lot easier. So you have to kind of start small. First, the milk, you transform then perhaps the yogurt. Then you start um, trying out some of the plant based meats that are available. And once you found your things that you and your family like, it becomes easier to stick to those. So that's one of my tips. Another is if you have a situation in which, for one time, you know, you went back to the old habits, don't blame yourself. You were born and raised in a meat eating culture. It's not your fault. It's just a new kind of way of thinking and living. So I would say if that happens, it has happened to me when I was traveling and I was somewhere, wasn't prepared, there was nothing available. And then, of course, I need to be healthy as well. And then so I enjoy it. Sometimes when I do field work, um, like I said, I'm an anthropologist, so I work with really poor people. If they offer me something and they have no alternative, I'm not going to reject that. I'll just be grateful. So that's another thing. Then, you know, the experiment hasn't stopped. You can just go back like, oh, okay, so I made a sidestep back to my old habits, but now I'll continue. And I guess a third thing is you really have to learn to cook in a different way, which sounds more terrifying than it is. But I think a big mistake that a lot of people make is that they keep on cooking exactly the same recipes as they used to, but now they leave out the meat. So you'll have like the potatoes, the vegetables, and the chicken, but without the chicken. Now that is a very boring dinner, and it's also not very healthy. So it really helps. I think within a month or so, you'll have the neck. But before that, it really helps to buy a comfort food style vegan cookbook. There's lots of them. You know, there's also vegan cookbooks who only do salads, but nobody likes that. So just a really comfort food style vegan cookbook with dishes that really speak to you. And then, you know, at first, do the recipes that they do for you so that you get used to it, because the mix is different often. So it's more grains, it's more veggies, it's perhaps a bit of sweet potato extra. Perhaps there is some seitan or tofu or tempeh that you want to try. You know, but you'll have to kind of get into it, and then after a few weeks, it will feel more natural. But don't keep cooking as you used to.
Something you said there really struck me. You said, you know, when you're going to a dinner party, you do make it known that you eat plant-based meals. I think there's something to be said for being loud and proud with your dietary habits. Same for, you know, people who are living sober, right? There's something to be said for just putting it out there, being loud, proud, and bold about it, instead of keeping it to yourself and just hoping, crossing your fingers that um, everybody will just know without you ever saying anything.
Absolutely. And I so agree with you. I think we live in a very violent system where we have become used to the fact that we kill lots and lots of animals. We use them for testing and experimenting. And so if you dare to step away from that and say, no, it's not okay, I don't want to do that, then you, at least you don't have to be ashamed. You don't have to be, you know, thinking that you're the best, because I think we all, I often say to my students, I teach at a university, um, I may be vegan, but perhaps I'm wearing a jeans that was made by child slaves, right? Like I try to do my best on all levels, but you can never be perfect. And we don't have to act as if it's only black or white, hero versus bad person. It's much more gray than that. But at least you don't have to be ashamed about it. And so I prepare, I tell people, yes, I'd love to come for dinner, but just know I'm plant based. If that's difficult for you, I'd love to bring something myself. And what I underestimated is how much people love to experiment with cooking. Sometimes they really see it as a challenge. So I've had friends who had never tried something vegan, but they were so proud because they made something that tasted amazing. And for them, it was new. It was something they kept in the family as a new family recipe. And that was because I dared to say, hey, watch out, I'm vegan. When I go on long flights, for example, which I sometimes have to do for my work, um, yes, then I prepare like you do, because on long flights it can be a bit, little bit hard. You get the vegan dish nowadays, but still you get snacks in between, and it's really nice to not become hungry. So instead, I take some vegan bars or some snacks that I really like, so that I don't feel like I'm not getting the nice things because I happen to be a vegan. Instead, I have all these yummy things, and then it's really not a problem.
One more question for you, something that tripped me up is going out to restaurants. A lot of restaurants these days have a vegan option or the ability to take a vegetarian dish and make it vegan. However, not all restaurants, at least not all restaurants by me, maybe like half of the restaurants. So, what steps do you go through before going to a restaurant? Do you check the menu? Do you only have, three or four that you frequent? Talk to me about all the routines surrounding going to a restaurant.
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, I live in Amsterdam where it's pretty easy because most of the restaurants have at least one, mostly 10, vegan options, or they have really good and friendly cooks who are excited to make something plant-based, because it's also very fashionable nowadays, right? Let's not forget that. It's, for a lot of chefs, it's really what they kind of serve as their pride. Like, they'll have amazing dishes. What I do if I'm not really sure about the restaurants is I do mention it beforehand when I make the reservations. I'll just tell them one of us is vegan. And I've actually never had a problem unless the restaurant is purely French, for example, and then still they can do it. But then if you would order a preset 5 course meal with a full table of people, and none of the other people are vegan, but I am, it might become a little bit hard for them because they want to serve us all the same thing, and then I cannot join that. But people also make it much harder than it is. I mean, pasta with wonderful tomato sauce is vegan. All the Indian kitchen dishes can be made really easily vegan. The same with other Southeast Asian dishes, for example. Um, a little bit of bread with tapenade instead of butter, even if there's really good plant-based butter nowadays, it's vegan. So it doesn't have to be that complicated. But just so that I don't end up feeling really comfortable, I do mention it when I make the reservation. Um, when I am in a situation where there's really nothing available, which I've had, and I need to eat because, I don't know, you're on holidays, you have the full evening to go, and there's really nothing because all the bread even has cow's butter in it, I still ask about it. Because I do believe that when the question raises, when there's more request for vegan meals, it's really giving a sign to chefs and to restaurant holders that there is a shift going on, that something is changing. And I think there is almost a being ashamed going on as well, where we don't dare to ask. But it is like, I sometimes say it's like political voting. Like, you really show, also if you do that in shops, if you buy the vegan burger and not the regular burger, then you show that there's more demand for the vegan products. And then the owner of the supermarket will see that in his numbers, and before you know, he will buy in more of that stuff. And that's how it works with restaurants as well. So I've had the opportunity to come back to restaurants that before had nothing vegan on the menu. They would make it especially for me. And then 2 years later, I come back and they have like four dishes. And that's probably because I asked. So they become aware, like, oh, there's actually an audience that wants this. And other people might have asked as well. So I always recommend people just ask, just mention it. You don't have to be an asshole about it, but you can ask, hey, can you make something vegan, or is there something vegan on the menu? And if you prepare restaurants, then it's easier for them.
Hmm. I like what you said there about conscious consumerism, right? That essentially, I talk about conscious consumerism a lot on this show with regard to stuff, what we buy, but you're bringing up conscious consumption quite literally. What we consume can and does inform the market that we want to see more of the plant-based options on the market. So I really love that quite literal connection there. Roanne, tell us where my listeners can find your new book, Once Upon a Time We Ate Animals.
You can buy it in all the bookshops, and you can buy it online already. And people can find me on my website, roannevanvoorst.com. So that's ROANNEVANVOORST. It's a hard Dutch name. Sorry for that. Or on Instagram at Roanne Van Voorst.
Well, I will link to your book and your website and your Instagram in this week's show notes. But I just want to say to you personally, thank you so much for coming on, sharing your insight. And the takeaway that I received from our conversation was that plant based, that transition is happening right now. It is the way of the future. And so I personally can either hop on the train, or be left behind. That's my personal takeaway.
Yeah, we don't want to be regarded as the old-fashioned grannies that stuck to the old things, right?
Yes. Well, Roanne, thank you so much for your time. I wish you much success with the launch of your new book. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks for having me.